Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the president of MassMEDIC, and it's my pleasure to welcome you once again to another of our webinar series. Today, we're going to be looking at current trends and emerging issues in the FDA's medical device enforcement. A very, very critical topic, and we're lucky enough to have some shared insights from our special guests and our member Covington. Today, your speakers will be Pamela Forrest. She's the co-chair of Covington's medical device practice, and an old friend of MassMEDIC, Mutahar Shamsi. He's not a lawyer, but he was with the FDA for 30 years in various positions, and you probably recognize him from his time as the FDA's New England District Director. I know he appeared at some of our FDA updates over those years, and we thank him and welcome him back to our virtual stage this time. I think we're going to have a very engaging and enlightening conversation today. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, so feel free to put them in the chat function on your screen, and we'll have a guided Q&A at the end of the program. But first, I'm going to hand it over to Pamela, and she's going to take us here through the presentation. Just a quick note for all of you, we always record these programs. They will be available on demand, as likely as well as the slides, to everyone who registered for the program. So we appreciate your time, and we appreciate everyone being with us. Pamela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to talk about what I know everyone is interested in, the important topic of FDA medical device enforcement at a really unusual time in the history of FDA and our society as a whole. Mutahar, if you want to advance to the agenda slide.
Sure.
So we, taking a close look at the FDA medical device enforcement landscape, find it to be more than meets the eye. It's a complex and unpredictable landscape, and that's really what we want to talk about over the next hour. On the one hand, there's really been a sharp decline in what we think of as traditional FDA enforcement, which is warning letters. And we're going to kind of go into that more granularly and talk about what the factors are driving that steep decline in warning letters, which has really been going on for the last 5 or 6 years. But we want to move beyond warning letters and look at what else is happening in the enforcement landscape. And from where we sit, there's actually quite a bit going on, just not in the normal traditional sense of warning letters, but rather through what we think of as more non-traditional mechanisms. We'll then talk about the issue of the day, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the different enforcement patterns that have been triggered by the pandemic. And lastly, we'll opine on what may lay ahead in terms of FDA enforcement in the medium and longer term. So with that, let's take a look at first what is the traditional measure of FDA enforcement, and that is device warning letters. And I think this graph really kind of says the whole story, which is starting in the sort of 2013 to 14 time frame, we really began a steep and steady decline in overall warning letters to the medical device industry. So now let's jump in, and Mutahar, why don't you talk about the sort of quality system side of that graph?
Sure, thanks, Pam. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your time, and I know it's valuable. We certainly appreciate it. So if you look at the warning letter, the quality system warning letter graph follows that quite closely with the overall total warning letters that was in the last slide. And what do you make of this slide? Is it that industry is more compliant? I'm not sure if everyone believes that, but that I suppose could be one explanation. But let's put these in context. The number of the warning letters as they have precipitously dropped is significant when you compare to the number of medical device recalls that have issued over the last 8 years, from 2012 until the present. Interestingly, in 2013, where you see, well, from 2013 on, the recall events hover around 1,000 events per year, which is quite striking considering the number of actual quality system warning letters that are sent. And typically, the driver of recalls is just insufficient quality system element. And interestingly, around 2012, there were only about 400 recalls, so it was quite a big jump from 2013 on. But yet the warning letters were in decline. The other interesting thing here, if we look at recalls, is also that the Class 1 recalls, Class 2 is where most of the classification of these recalls lie. But even the Class 1s were anywhere between 30 to 70 Class 1 recalls per year. In fact, last year there were about 60 Class 1 recalls, but only 22 quality system warning letters sent. So it's interesting to look at those two figures. Another way of looking at this as well is that in the pharma area, quality system over the last couple of years, quality system warning letters have increased. And they've done less inspections than, there's been less pharma inspections than device inspections. So it's interesting even between centers how this change has happened. And so what would be the drivers for such a steep decline in quality system warning letters or device warning letters in general? Well, the biggest by far issue is the medical device single audit medical device single audit program that a CDRH has implemented since 2017. And that has been, that was under a pilot stage for a couple of years before that, but as CDRH has relied heavily on the MDSAP inspection process, as well as I think a number of industry. There's just less inspections that FDA is doing, and therefore that's going to end up with less warning letters. Additionally, the MDSAP inspections they're not the same as an FDA inspection. An FDA investigator is trained to develop evidence, whereas an MDSAP auditor is just a spot check. It's not exactly an investigation or inspection. And it's not MDSAP alone, though, even though that's one of the largest contributors. There's been sort of a confluence of events. If you go down to the lower left quadrant, CDRH has had since 2011, 12, 13, and on, around that time of the drop of warning letters, there's been a huge philosophical change from CDRH that relying on enforcement action alone doesn't translate into high quality medical devices. They, back several years ago, they had put out some white papers that compliance, in some of the talks that were given by CDRH leaders, that compliance to the regs doesn't equal quality, that industry's continued focus on non-compliance as a barrier to medical device quality. And so what they've done is they partnered with the Medical Device Innovative Consortium to come up with ways of instituting a case for quality, where different programs, libraries, and lots of different pilot programs have been implemented with a focus on collaboration. And just some examples of the Voluntary Improvement Program, which uses the capability maturity model integration to look at continuous improvement of quality in an organization. There's a new pilot that came out a couple of months ago, the Accelerate Sustainability Capability pilot study, which the FDA CDRH is engaging manufacturers that typically have problems maintaining compliance, which is also very interesting. And of course, the digital health software pre-cert program, which they're focusing on a manufacturer demonstrating robust quality culture rather than focusing on the actual device or the software itself. And actually, something came out about an hour ago on an update on the medical device pre-cert. I haven't had a chance to read it, but all of this shows that, and if I looked at it real quickly, it was just a sort of trend away from the traditional GMP inspections. And in fact, all these programs waive quality system inspections. So it's just a movement away from the traditional way that FDA was conducting enforcement. And along with that, though, is around 2013 to 15, both large organizations, ORA and CDRH, went through alignments and reorganizations respectively. And these were, major upheavals in the way things are run, and the way things are structured, and the way processes are implemented. The field went away from traditional geographic multidisciplinary approach to just one program over multiple areas. And that has resulted in a lot of, I think, changes. A lot of investigators changed programs, a lot of leaders have changed programs. So you have people that are just not familiar with maybe a particular program in these positions, leading to making it difficult to send warning letters out. Because when you send any type of action, it's not that the investigator goes out, does an inspection, throws it over the fence, and a warning letter pops out. There's a lot of coordination and collaboration within each investigator, supervisor, compliance officer, and branch directors. And if now spread out over multiple geographic areas and multiple time zones, that just makes it a little bit more difficult. So that, I think, is also a driver, as well as like the current political environment. Is anti-regulatory, somewhat anti-government. But this didn't start with the current administration. This drop in warning letters and this philosophy change to more collaboration started, in 2015. So it's certainly the current administration has added to more warning letters, but it just drives that number down further. Pam, we're just going to go into also in advertising and promotion.
Yes. Thanks, Mo. So, on the other side of the equation, on advertising promotion, again, the graph, largely mirrors the overall trend, which is downward in terms of promotion warning letters. And to be clear, what this graph shows in terms of promotion is really off-label promotion. This graph doesn't reflect warning letters where a product was wholly unapproved and is being marketed, but rather this is really products that have a clearance or approval, and FDA alleges that that off-label claims are being made. And so we see, a sharp drop really starting in 2013, going down, a spike up in 2019, and then 2020, sort of all bets are off. We're in the pandemic, and we're going to talk about the enforcement that's gone on in the pandemic, which is promotional in nature, largely, but that is really directed towards wholly unapproved products. So it looks as if there's been, just understandably a diversion of FDA focus to COVID-related products in terms of promotional issues. Mo, you want to switch slides? So if we dissect really what's gone on in terms of promotional enforcement, I think there's a complex constellation of factors. On the one hand, and this in and of itself could be a 3-hour discussion. I think probably the audience is familiar that over the last several years, there have been a number of challenges based on the First Amendment to the long-standing prohibition against off-label promotion. And FDA has sustained some losses to those challenges. And, collectively, the thinking is that those losses have made FDA somewhat more hesitant to enforce in the promotional space in terms of traditional warning letters. So our thinking is that that drop that we see starting around 2014-15 is probably largely related to those First Amendment-based losses. But we also feel that it's a much more complex picture than that, particularly in the last couple of years. We continue to see FDA interested in promotional issues and engaging with industry on those promotional concerns, but in a less traditional manner, not in the warning letter so much, but more informal engagement through email inquiries. Perhaps in the course of a 510K review, the agency takes a look at the company's website and raises questions about current claims being made. So we certainly don't see silence from the agency on promotional issues, but we don't see the voice being spoken so much through the traditional mechanism of warning letters. And then, of course, as I mentioned, during the pandemic, FDA has focused heavily on enforcement related to unsubstantiated COVID-related claims. And we're going to talk about that in depth in just a few minutes. And I'm going to turn this next slide over to Mo, but what I just want to tee up, and it's sort of, one of our themes is don't get too comfortable in the enforcement environment. On the one hand, as we've said, there's a steep decline in warning letters, but as Mo is going to discuss, even the warning letters that have been issued, we think there are some important messages and themes to discuss. So with that, Mo, do you want to
sure.
call out some of those themes?
Yeah, exactly. It's not a time to relax, as Pam has said. There are some interesting trends in what the warning letters were issued for this past fiscal year. And maybe I think FDA is CDRH and the field of choosing their battles a little bit, maybe a bit more wisely when they can. And the first one is that there's been an increase in warning letters issued by ORA. And so what that tells me is that after the realignment went in effect in 2017, I think the field is getting used to this new structure, and the coordination is a little bit better between, say, the investigator and the compliance officer and the supervisor that may be in different geographic locations. So, I mean, it's quite stark. In this year, there were 18 so far. One was issued signed by ORA, and last year there's only 8. So, 10 more. And also, the not to mention CDRH also, when they underwent their organization, that also had some delays in their processes, which letters they need to concur on, which ones they need to review, who does it, and so forth. The other point I want to bring up here, is also the use of recidivist warning letters. For those who don't know what they are, it's a recidivist warning letter is essentially a warning letter sent to almost like a two-time offender. So a company gets a warning letter, it gets closed out, they correct the deviations, the violations, it gets closed out. They appear compliant, but then the next inspection shows that they went back to their old behavior of non-compliance. So rather than sending, rather than taking a judicial action, which may be the case, if it's, because that's what a warning letter tells you, if you don't fix these, the next step is seizure and directed prosecution. The agency will send a recidivist warning letter giving the firms another chance to comply. And there were 3 of those this year, and this is something that the agency doesn't take lightly, but it could also lead to why there were maybe some less judicial actions than there have been in the past. As Pam mentioned, there's been a scrutiny of the unapproved COVID products. I mean, we'll go into that a little bit later, but FDA is always looking for those companies that are, distributing products without proper marketing authorization. So that's something that I need to be aware about. Another interesting topic, which I didn't put in the slide though, is one on, FDA is still looking at combination products. That's another area that they look at. There was one letter this past fiscal year on a convenience kit. So they are looking at it. The FDA has put out multiple guidance on combination products. The interesting thing about this one particular warning letter was that this particular company did everything opposite of what the guidance said. So almost inexcusable in a way, but they put out the guidance for a reason. It should be read, looked at, and they are looking. Another area that sort of maybe dovetails into FDA's focus on women's health and other safety issues is warning letters on post-approval studies. They've issued about 7 of these in the last couple of years. And again, that's an area that typically didn't get much activity, but when the agency issues an order for a post-approval study, and they expect, they may not be clear and they may not be easy to do, but they do expect people to follow them. So another area to watch out for.
Thanks, Mo.
Yep.
So we keep talking about this term non-traditional enforcement. So let us share with you kind of what we're thinking about with that. And here we say rhetoric versus reality, and I think that goes to the complexity and the nuance of the current enforcement landscape. On the one hand, there's clearly a drumbeat of political discourse emanating from the current administration that de-emphasizes regulation, that emphasizes small government. We're familiar with the executive order regarding 2-for-1 regulation. So certainly there's a narrative around less regulation and less enforcement. And as we've seen in the first part of the presentation, that does align with the steep decline in warning letters, although that steep decline started well before the current administration took office. So that one is harder to reconcile. But then if we take another step and think about what's really going on alongside this narrative that emanates from the administration, I think we see a number of factors. First, an increasing reliance on non-traditional enforcement. And one way we think of that is FDA's use of public safety communications, which we see more and more of to convey safety-related concerns. We also see FDA, CDRH, focusing in a targeted fashion on certain industry sectors and issues. And at the end of this section of our presentation, we'll show you an interesting timeline of FDA's actions in the women's health area, which really does show a coordinated CDRH focus to bring out safety-related concerns with regard to women's health. We also see a trend toward deeper scrutiny throughout the entire device life cycle. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment and how that seems to come from the reorganization that has occurred within CDRH. And then I think lastly, and an interesting observation that we've made over the last year or so is we just see a more informal agency. FDA interacting more with companies through email correspondence on various concerns, as opposed to, again, the traditional warning letter enforcement. So Mo, would you like to talk a bit about the Medical Device Safety Action Plan and how that kind of sets the stage for what we see as the perspective FDA has that's guiding its enforcement priorities?
Yeah, what's guiding their enforcement priorities is really reflected in the implementation of the Medical Device Safety Action Plan, which came out in 2018. And the three of the areas that the Medical Device Safety Action Plan addresses is the agency wants to be able to react quickly to certain signal detections in safety. And that's where the emphasis on timely communication and resolution of safety issues comes in. That's something that they're very, very attuned to. The action plan also addresses areas of interest, such as not only cybersecurity and women's health we've talked about, but also certain surgical tools and types of biomaterials, such as the hip-on-hip implants. The other driver is also as Pam mentioned, the total life cycle approach. And that approach is what also drove the reorganization of CDRH, where OPEC, now the Office of Product Evaluation Quality, they don't have the single Office of Compliance, which have rather a interest, I mean, we have the folks that were involved in pre-market and now also involved in post-market activities as well. Where the post-market activities are traditionally done with mostly field representatives. And the other interesting thing about the Medical Device Safety Action Plan is that there's very little on enforcement. There isn't anything that says we're going to, ensure more enforcement. We're not going to. There's nothing about we're going to send out more quality warning letters. It's all really balanced on, heavily geared toward improving innovation and improving communication and reacting to safety signals. And the total life cycle approach, as we've said, involves, what you have now is the old also device evaluation. The scientific reviewers and the experts there are involved not only with pre-market issues, but also heavily involved in post-market issues, such as recalls. So you're going to get now questions from much more sort of pointed, deeper technical questions into why did this recall happen? What was your risk assessment? Let's see your CAPA. Let's see your complaint investigations. Let's see your root cause investigations. A lot more those types of questions than you would take typically from the former ORA recall coordinators. And it's interesting because there's a lot of back and forth that goes in, on these questions where it's almost as if it's a negotiation on what to classify the recall as. That's something that never happened in the past, but we see that happening with some regularity with our clients, that the agency's really clamped on to this issue, and they want to make it a class 1, but we feel it's not even close to a class 1. There's also questions being raised during pre-market reviews on, let's look at your MDRs. Why was this an MDR? Let's look at this investigation. So a little sort of boundaries being expanded a bit. You have to remember that a lot of the folks that are asking these questions are probably not former investigators and have not been trained in sort of the traditional ways of the way typically FDA would ask these questions would be through an inspection and not through an email or a phone call. But obviously because of COVID, that's probably one reason why they're doing a lot of this. But even before COVID, I think we were seeing a lot of sort of deeper questions that typically save for an inspection. So we find that as an interesting point as well.
Yeah, and just to echo that, and the point we raised earlier is we just see more informal engagement with industry. I think concerns that historically we would have seen raised in warning letters and entitled letters are coming in sort of more just informal email correspondence, as I mentioned, perhaps in the course of a 510K review or even outside of that. Raising concerns that FDA has. And, I think along with that informality comes sort of lack of formal process or sort of lack of typical process. In the warning letter, we're used to, being required to respond within 15 working days. Sometimes the email correspondence asks us to respond more quickly than that. So I think but at the same time, the email correspondence is less public or not public at all. And so, from a sort of PR standpoint, perhaps less troublesome for industry, yet more unpredictable and sort of less wedded to typical process. So it's again, another aspect of the complexity of the enforcement landscape that we see.
Yeah, one of the things I also want to add, Pam, and the group is that with this point of recall, especially in recalls, what we see is the emphasis that they have on the severity of the issue as opposed to the probability of harm. Those questions come up often. What we've seen typically is a laser focus on the severity and really sort of a dismissal of the probability of harm, which is unusual because it doesn't really follow the ISO guidance. But so that's something that they need to be aware of. And really, yeah, the scrutiny on the overall classification of the recalls is something that's I've seen gone up quite a bit in the last year or two.
So, Mo, if we move on to the last slide in this section, which is the timeline that I mentioned on women's health. And again, women's health is one of the areas of interest that CDRH articulated in the Medical Device Safety Action Plan that came out in 2018, as Mo had mentioned. And this is an interesting timeline because it really does show this coordinated focus on different aspects of women's health. So for example, in April of 2018, FDA imposed certain restrictions on a permanently implanted birth control device for women. Then in July 2018, there was a safety communication issued on energy-based products to perform vaginal rejuvenation. And concurrent with that, FDA issued 7 has come to our attention letters. And I think what's noteworthy about that is that those it's come to our attention letters were actually posted on the FDA website, which is not something I've seen before. It's possible it's happened, but it's certainly not typical for those to be posted. Again, we see it as FDA using some of these non-traditional means to convey safety-related concerns. Then in February of 2019, again, 2 different safety communications on different areas of women's health. April 2019, FDA's order to cease distribution of vaginal mesh. And then just in May of this year, in the midst of the pandemic, 2 warning letters on to breast implant manufacturers, one on post-approval studies and the other on quality system and MDR. So, you know, I don't know that we all realized this was happening when it was happening, but when we step back and look at it, it does really appear that FDA has, through these various mechanisms, warning letters one of them, but a host of other mechanisms, has sort of executed against one aspect of the safety action plan to advance the agency's safety concerns around women's health. So now let's talk in a directed fashion about what's happening in terms of FDA enforcement in the COVID area. And, you know, as an overall matter, of course, we've seen FDA act very swiftly to address the shortage of critical medical devices. And the agency has done this through issuing multiple enforcement discretion policies and rapidly approving several emergency use authorizations. And it's really been an extraordinary time, I think, in the medical device industry and FDA's history in terms of rapid reaction to this pressing public health crisis. And then in the last few months, we've seen, I think, more of a look back on the part of FDA and to step back from some of these initial actions. There have been some EUAs, emergency use authorizations, have been revoked. Because FDA has become less convinced of the safety and effectiveness of those products. The risk-benefit analysis that allowed the EUAs to be issued has come into question. And then some of those more lenient policies that have allowed products to come to market under enforcement discretion have been rethought. Particularly one in the area of antibody tests, the serology tests. There was initially a policy that allowed those tests to come out without the submission of an EUA, and that was rethought in the last few months with a more stringent policy. So, you know, we talk. Again, we think about enforcement in a broad sense, and here we see rapid FDA responsive action to the pandemic, followed by, you know, a more deliberative rethinking of some of those initial swift actions. I think we can move to the next slide, Mo.
Yeah.
And then more concretely, in terms of traditional enforcement action, we've certainly seen CDRH react to what it views as violative COVID-related devices on the market, mainly in the area of unauthorized COVID test kits for home use. A number of warning letters were issued around those, and they were particularly stringent and harshly worded warning letters, giving companies only 48 hours to correct their actions. And FDA noted that the agency was publishing a list of firms that had received warning letters with the purpose of alerting consumers not to purchase those devices that were making misleading claims and had no marketing authorization. Mo, is there anything you wanted to add on that?
Sure. This just shows also the agency has many tools other than, say, the traditional compliance. Posting the warning letters on a particular subject is not new. They've done that during the compounding issue back in 2013, 14, 15, where all warning letters or UL 43s were posted to the FDA's website. These warning letters to these COVID, essentially these COVID websites, again, it's also not a new approach. The agency uses a technique called a cyber letter. It's called that, it's been around for a long time, but I think they call it that because they initially were sent to the internet address, the email address of that particular offending site. These are obviously probably sent to actual physical addresses, but it's the same type of approach where they've reviewed the site, they've found a lot of improper promotional or improper, a lot of misbranding charges essentially, and have warned them that they need to correct these, and not in the typical 15 days, but you've got 48 hours to correct this. So again, it's a tool that the agency can use, and it can be quite effective. There's always, in fact, they'll probably, with a lot of the investigators somewhat sidelined, one of the activities you would do is go on these websites and see what's going on. And so they've been very active, and they've also even asked the public to let them know if they see any websites that appear irregular, don't sound like it's the real thing or the correct thing. So there's a lot there that the agency can sift through, and they will keep on, I think, continue to do that.
Thanks, Mo. So why don't we move to the next slide? And I think just an area to highlight is FDA has certainly been collaborating with other agencies to coordinate enforcement in the COVID area. We've seen a number of FDA and FTC jointly issued warning letters to companies marketing products as COVID-19 treatments. This has been predominantly in the drug area, although there's been at least one to a marketer of a COVID-19 test kit for at-home use. And then we also see FDA and Customs collaborating to seize unapproved COVID-19 test kits and face masks. So again, FDA has quickly responded in terms of issuing policies to get products out on the market to respond to the pandemic, and is also quickly responding in collaboration with sister agencies to enforce against what it views as troublesome products that have been placed on the market. And then we've also seen the pendulum swing back and forth on FDA inspections. Mo, do you want to address that?
Sure, Pam, thanks. And so as the pandemic was underway back in March, the agency announced that they would postpone most domestic and foreign inspections, and would only do those that were of critical need, mission critical inspections. And I don't think they did much. I think there was a few maybe drug ones that were done during this time frame. But back in July, they did announce their intention to restart on-site inspections. But it's not a simple matter of, okay, open the floodgates and let's just go out and inspect. As you know, there's still a pandemic raging on, and there's a certain process that the agency needs to use before they send anybody out there. There's so many things that are up in the air. I'm sure a lot of your facilities aren't open yet or limited to how many people can be in a facility at one time. Inspections are disruptive. So a lot of policies have to be put in place. There is a rating system that they alluded to that would be used. And a lot of this is based on also county results. So you can imagine it's, even though it's product-based, the organization is product-based, but it covers multiple states, and with that also tens of multiples of counties. Trying to keep track of, which counties or which areas have seen a decrease in COVID or increase in COVID is pretty tricky. So the agency really has, I think, kind of a difficult time to try to get back into sites with any regularity as they were before. Much like in the rest of life, it's just very difficult. But as they get out there, we'll probably see an uptick in enforcement. There's, if they're looking at mission critical, they're probably going to look at class 3 devices first, or things that follow up to class 1 recalls, maybe issues where there's been a confidential informant that may have some information that's could be particularly egregious. So those things would tend to, if it's bad, would result in an action. So, they will probably do a number of inspections still. I think try them virtually or via telecommunication, via like this, via Zoom or net meeting or whatever platform's available, before they really get, people really feel comfortable of having others visiting facilities.
Okay, thanks, Mo.
Yeah, we'll look ahead here.
So just to conclude, some thoughts about what may be coming, and there's certainly the potential for a change in administration in a couple of months, and with that, there's certainly the possibility of an uptick in regulation and enforcement. Again, though, to emphasize that the decline we've seen in the last several years in terms of FDA or device warning letters did not begin at the beginning of the current administration. It well preceded that. So it's much, I think, more complex than sort of which party's in power in terms of what we see in enforcement. But again, it certainly is possible that patterns will begin to alter if we have a new administration. And then, Mo, I know your thinking is there could continue to be a further decline.
Right. Yeah, Pam. You've seen in the trade press that the last couple of years, CDRH has been meant to harmonize the current QSR regulations, the 820 regulations, with ISO 1345. It was supposed to happen, I think, last year or the year before, and then there's just been delays because it's not as easy as you may think to just implement a new regulation, and obviously COVID now has complicated things a bit with the priority of the agency. But typically when the agency comes out with new regulations, there is somewhat of a grace period or another enforcement discretion period. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is some sort of enforcement discretion for a while firms get used to the ISO 1345 as opposed to the QSRs. But I wouldn't expect too much of a time because most companies should be following ISO 1345 anyways. It's not that far off from the QSRs. But I think when that happens, there will be more of a decline in warning letters because of most likely they'll have an enforcement discretion. It could be based on the classification of the device, like they did with UDIs, or it could be just the size of the company, or who knows how they're going to do it. But there most likely will be an enforcement discretion for some time. We also talked about earlier about the focus on healthcare. That's something the agency is always interested in, whether it's COVID or any other type of fraud. That's something that's with the internet now, it's almost like shooting fish in a barrel. There's so much out there that if people can't get out into the field, they can certainly look at fraudulent sites and gather evidence for some warning letters. So that's an area that I think would see continued action. And Pam, you had some on the other two bullets.
Yeah. So we've seen Congress take a deep interest through investigatory work into manufacturers of pandemic-related medical devices, masks, for example. Looking at potentially inexperienced suppliers being awarded government contracts. So there's a plethora of congressional investigations into sort of pandemic-related medical device issues, and I think those will be with us for some time. But I think probably the most pressing question of the day is, what happens next in terms of the really flood of devices that have entered the market via emergency use authorizations or FDA's many enforcement discretion policies, where FDA has waived most of the core controls in order to stimulate the introduction of more of those critical devices onto the market. What will happen once the pandemic lifts and the market still has these devices out there? And I think that is a question mark. It's not clear around the EUA devices. The statute says that FDA will consult with the manufacturer around the disposition of the devices. So it's possible we'll see some recalls of devices with expired EUAs. In terms of the enforcement discretion policies, it's possible we'll see new guidance documents that lay out grace periods to come into compliance on a phased-in basis, and it's really it's a big question mark. We don't have much indication of what will come next, but I think probably something will come next, and we'll look with anticipation to see sort of the post-pandemic chapter and what will be the disposition of the many products that have entered the market in response to the public health emergency. So that concludes our formal presentation, and we'd be delighted to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, please go ahead and put any questions you have into the Zoom chat. Let's start with one here. Did any of the QSR warning letters over the last few years involve cybersecurity issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think so. I can do a deeper dive just to check. There actually, no, I'm sorry, there was one. There was one from last year that had to do with I can't say the name because I think they were a client, but it was a company that had some issues a couple of years ago on cyber. And the agency did send a warning letter to them on that.
Excellent. So once again, if you have a question, you feel free to submit it in the chat. We'll go ahead and ask it. Maybe we could touch a little bit more on a potential Biden administration and how long it would take for changes to start taking effect. But perhaps say there is a turnover in the executive branch. You have a new president. I would assume there's new directives there. How long does that usually typically take to kind of filter down to the enforcement area if there is a change in strategy or thought process on enforcement?
Well, Brian, I'll give my take and then let Mutahar chime in. I mean, my view is it takes a lot of time, and that there is often, as I think see in many ways today, a disconnect between sort of what the highest levels of the government, that sort of the tone that is set, versus what the sort of career FDAers implement in terms of their vision of enforcement and regulation. So while I think it can have an impact, I think it's certainly not overnight, and it can take years to have really a sea change. But Mo, what is your view?
Yeah, a lot of it depends on who's the commissioner. I mean, the agency does take its lead from the commissioner, and whether the commissioner's stance is that of a very, say, proactive enforcement or rather a proactive collaboration, or it all depends. I mean, saw that with Dr. Kessler way back, even with Dr. Hamburg, there was a switch to enforcement. So it all depends on when when there's a new commissioner and that new commissioner gets sworn in. There's also HHS as well. The higher ups at HHS also direct what happens at FDA quite a bit. All the political appointments, what their agendas are and what they would like to see. It does get filtered down through the different agency leaders. DOJ as well, and the appetite that FDA can't take actions without DOJ. So what DOJ's appetite is also for actually taking some action. So it does depend on who's there, and it takes a little bit of time, but depending on what the situation is, it could be relatively fast, or could take a couple of years.
Great. Yes, and I think we should note also Dr. Stephen Hahn is, while he's in his first year as commissioner, it's been a rather unusual, sort of honeymoon period for him. So
no, it's been difficult for him. I think it's been really just really hard. I mean, it must be just terrible. I just, he's got so many different pressures that I don't remember the administration putting this much pressure on FDA. I think for a while FDA was kind of out of the limelight, but you never know. This disease happened and then thrust them right back, put them right in the forefront. So it's tough. It's tough to handle the political the political nature of the job with you've got a job to do, which is to protect the public, and it's difficult. It really is.
Yeah, certainly. Here's another question. Should companies get certification of ISO 13485 now if they don't have a CE mark at this point? And then the follow-up question to that is, when will the QSR and ISO 1345 harmonization be complete and the FDA will use that as the inspection guideline?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll take the second one first. That harmonization, I'm not sure. What I've seen in the press, that it could take a couple of years. What the agency is supposed to do by the end of the year, so I'm reading December, they'll put out a proposed rule maybe, and then there'll be comment period, and then redraft, and then implementation. So it could take a couple of years, because also the agency still hasn't. I don't think they figured this out quite yet. Is all the processes that get around, and all the internal procedures that get around 820 and not toward 1345. So I still think they're working on which parts of 1345 they're going to keep, which parts they're not going to keep, which parts are they going to what parts are they going to enforce as part of the enforcement discretion, and also training. They're going to have to retrain a lot of investigators. A lot of investigators have not too familiar with this. They haven't inspected toward the ISO guidelines. And that's going to take, you've got hundreds of investigators that need to be trained on a different way of looking at a different set of rules, even though they are quite similar. But there's going to have to be a change. The QZ method's going to have to be jettisoned for something else. So it's going to take some time. I wouldn't say it's going to be in a couple of months. Yeah, they'll have it. Something will come out at the end of the year apparently, and then it'll take some time for it to be implemented. So you've got time to transfer into ISO 1345. And then the question of should they have a CE? I mean, if you need a CE mark, obviously, for your product in Europe, that's the thing you should do. But if you want to get one just for the sake of having one to see if you comply, that might be a good exercise as well to consider. But I don't think it's absolutely necessary.
There's another question on EUAs and what happens to them in a new administration. I would imagine that the EUA goes until the emergency is over, right? I mean, I don't think that's going to fall under sort of the political change. But I do have sort of a question about the backlog on EUAs and typical enforcement. I mean, is there going to need to be inspections of every company that had an EUA? And what does that do to the backlog of inspections and things like that?
I guess I don't think we have thought that there would necessarily be an inspection of every company that has an EUA. I mean, largely to my understanding, compliance with QSR is waived in EUAs. So unless I'm misunderstanding the question, I wouldn't see sort of a QSR inspection as a priority for EUA holders.
Yeah, I agree, Pam. The only thing I can foresee is maybe if there was some adverse events that the agency wants to follow up on, or if they do put out an order that says all devices under this particular EUA must be destroyed or must be whatever, recalled. You have until a certain date. There may be follow-up inspections to make sure that that gets done at facilities, but I don't see that as a routine.
Yeah, it's also sort of, I mean, given the vastness of what we're talking about, the scope of the number of products that are out there, it's, I think, logistically, it's just difficult to imagine FDA trying to undertake that sort of inspectional effort.
Great, thank you for that clarity. I appreciate it. We do have time for just one more, because we are bumping up on the hour.
Sure.
So that's just an open call if anyone has another one. Otherwise, seeing none appear, I want to thank both of you. I mean, what a really informative session this was. I'm sure everybody really appreciated it. What's the best way if people have questions they might want to ask after the, perhaps not in a group setting, is there a way that they can contact you?
Certainly. I mean, by email is probably the easiest. And Brian, I don't know if the audience has been provided with our email addresses or if there's an easy way to do that, but I think that would probably make the most sense.
Great. We can certainly add that in the follow-up email we're going to send out to everybody who registered.
We'd be happy to talk with anyone who has any follow-up questions. It would be our pleasure.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much to both of you for your time, and I want to thank you to all of our audience who came and attended today. Once again, this has been a MassMEDIC webinar, and our guests from Covington, they're a great law firm and a terrific member of MassMEDIC. So thanks for everything you guys do, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.